It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Marilyn Stoll. Dr. Stoll is an associate professor of philosophy. She published several articles on business and environmental ethics in highly regarded peer-reviewed journals, like the Journal of Business Ethics, and she has a forthcoming chapter on environmental ethics and fisheries in the Routledge Companion to Environmental Ethics. She's also co-editor of the Stakeholder Theory, Essential Readings in Ethical Leadership and Management. Today, Dr. Stoll is presenting on the perils of plastic, a primer for business ethics. Dr. Stoll, the floor is yours.
Yeah. So first off, I just want to give you a heads up. If you're wondering, like, why are there so many references to Europe in here? I actually originally gave this paper in Dublin, Ireland, so I kind of tweaked some of my examples for the audience there. I have updated it a little bit, so I added some more American references so you don't feel alone or like I'm not really talking to you. So that is an add-on that I did. And if you really love this topic, if you're like, oh my gosh, thinking about environmental ethics is amazing, I am teaching environmental ethics next spring. It counts for global credit for core. So students out there, you could do a whole semester thinking about stuff like this. But to everybody else, the perils of plastics, a primer for international business ethics. So first off, the first thing we got to think about is, okay, like, yeah, plastics, I'm sure you've heard, it's a problem, but like, how bad is it really? Well, if we think about it, plastic pollution has actually increased tenfold just since 1980. Half of all the plastics that were ever made have actually been made in just the last 15 years. So a lot of our plastics problem, it's an accumulation from the past and it like hasn't gone anywhere. So it's just piling up out there. Production went from 2.3 million tons in 1950 to 448 million tons by 2015. And that amount is expected to double by the time we hit 2050. Right now, and actually not right now, like before COVID, so it's worse right now, the world produced 300 million tons of plastic every year. And if you're thinking about like, well, what is it? Well, 40% of it, so just under half, that's single-use packaging. There's about 4.4 to 12.7 million metric tons of plastic that is added to the oceans every single year. And by 2050, at least according to one study, there's going to be more plastic in the ocean than actual fish. Okay, so that's a bit concerning. Oceans weren't really like evolved for that much plastic. You know, fish, maybe, yes, but plastic, not so much, right? But about 8 million tons of plastic flow into the world's oceans every year from coastal nations, which is the equivalent of lighting 5 bags of trash on fire on every foot of coastline globally. Additives to plastics, on the one hand, you know, it's great that they make them more durable, so when we're using them, but then the problem is they may not break down in the environment for a really long time. It might take them up to 400 years. So once they're made, they're just out there, right? Like they're in the environment. A report from October 2020 now estimates that US plastic pollution is actually substantially worse than we had previously thought. So what the newer research has done is try to look at more of the likely pollution that we're creating. In 2016, new estimates suggest that the US actually produced 5 times as much plastic pollution as it did in 2010. But even in 2016, the United States generated the largest amount of plastic waste of any country in the world, 42 megatons. The US is the second largest exporter of plastic waste globally. Each year, at least 1 million metric tons of our exported waste ends up polluting the environment abroad. So it's not just that, you know, we're polluting our own environment. A big chunk of the plastic that we're using ends up getting dumped around the world, oftentimes in developing nations who really don't have the infrastructure to afford it and who are already especially vulnerable, especially negatively impacted by other pollution, oftentimes our fault too. So yeah, that's sort of morally problematic that the US is only 4% of the world's global population, but we're responsible for 17% of global coastal plastic pollution. And the problem of plastic pollution truly is global. A 2019 analysis in the UK found microplastic pollution in all 10 lakes, rivers, and reservoirs sampled. Over 1,000 small pieces of plastic per liter were found in the River Thames near Manchester, which was revealed, and that says last year was actually 2018, as the most contaminated place tested worldwide yet at that time. In 2017, microplastics were found in tap water around the world. And in October 2019, it was found that plastic is being consumed by people in Europe, Japan, and Russia. Microplastics are pretty much everywhere, okay? They are in you, they are in your poop, okay? They are in the bottom of the Marianas Trench, they're in the most remote areas of the tops of the Pyrenees, and they are in the Arctic. So the reach of plastic is ubiquitous. It's just everywhere at this point. Oops, went too quick there. No, I didn't. I just forgot to put the appear function on. So another thing that has happened is that COVID has been actually increasing the amount of plastic pollution that we create. So you may have noticed during the shutdown, a lot of stores have started to bag using your personal reusable fabric bags. Now, and they say that that's a safety measure, but if you look at the scientific evidence out there, the study that this is based on was paid for by the Plastics Council, and if we look at the science that's not paid for by them, turns out COVID actually lives longer on plastic surfaces, most likely than fabric ones. So it's not entirely clear that that's a justified measure. One of the things that happened in the shutdown was that the fossil fuel industry was not having a good time, right? Like they were losing a lot of the buyers for their products. They said, you know what, let's amp up the plastic production. So the oil used to make plastic was a lot cheaper than it had been before. In the UK, with its 66.7 million inhabitants, if every single citizen used just one mask each day, that alone would generate at least 60,000 tons of contaminated plastic waste. If American medical waste were to parallel study of plastic waste in Wuhan, China, when COVID-19 first hit, then the United States could generate an entire year's worth of medical waste in just 2 months. The World Health Organization, understandably, has called for an increase in PPE, that's personal protective equipment production, of 40% increase. But if every single person globally used just one disposable face mask each day, the pandemic in just 1 month could yield waste of 129 billion face masks and 65 billion gloves. And it's not just the medical, single-use plastics that are increasing in pollution because of COVID-19. Packaged takeout meals and home delivery groceries in Singapore ended up generating an extra 1,400 tons of plastic waste during their 8-week lockdown. The market in global plastic packaging is projected to grow from 909.2 billion in 2019 to 1,012.6 billion by 2021, at a compound annual growth rate of 5.5%. And that's mostly due to the pandemic response. And if you even just think about your life, right? Like you're probably ordering more things in the mail, that comes with packaging. You're not sitting in the restaurant as much, maybe you're getting takeout more, right? And that pile of grocery bags is piling up in your kitchen, right? Like we can see it in our own lives. Well, is it really anything to worry about, right? Like what exactly is the problem with all of this plastic? Well, almost 700 species are known to be affected by plastics, including many species that are endangered. Impacts range from being strangled by fishing gear, starvation induced by a stomach full of plastic, and damage to reproductive systems. Microplastics are found in over 100 aquatic species, including, the aquatic species you may be eating in your diet. Plastics in the ocean also pick up other toxins, and that it concentrates them. Things like polychlorinated biphenyls, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and heavy metals, which, in big enough quantities, they can end up damaging the liver. Plastics are also consumed by land animals, including humans, elephants, zebras, hyenas, tigers, camels, and cattle, sometimes even resulting in death. Harms caused can affect an organism at every level of biological organization. It can alter gene expression, cells, and tissues. It can sometimes cause death. It can alter population size and community structure. Microplastics can impair reproduction and development and alter species function, dispersion, and assembly. For humans, It's harder to say exactly what the impacts of plastics are with certainty. Part of it, it's so ubiquitous, right? Like, where's our control group? But there is concern regarding the impacts on the immune and endocrine systems. Studies are difficult, again, because it's just everywhere, and it can have a multitude of effects depending upon the size, composition, and means by which a person is exposed. Nanoparticles of cells can even penetrate into human cells. So what have the governments of the world been doing about this, right? Have they been trying to address plastic pollution? Well, in March of 2019, the European Union approved a measure to ban single-use plastics, including plastic cutlery, straws, and single-use bags by 2021. 32 nations, many of which were in Africa, also instituted bans on single-use plastics. And just a little backdrop on the situation in Africa. I mean, one of the frustrations is a lot of pollution from the developing world is then dumped on them. So part of it, some of it's sort of like, it's you, first world nations dumping your trash on us. Many bans are more piecemeal rather than national. For example, the state of California in the United States banned single-use small plastic bottles in the bathrooms of hotels with over 50 rooms by January of 2023. Now, one thing to note, single-use bans have been put on hold as of right now in many locations. For example, bans in California, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, and Maine, they're bag bans. Because of COVID-19, they've sort of said, well, we'll put it on hold for now, even though there isn't really a lot of evidence of surface transmission via cloth bags, and some evidence suggesting the virus survives longer on plastic. Well, all right, so that's just the backdrop, right? So what does this mean in terms of morally? Like, what are we required to do? How do we figure out what's right and what's wrong when it comes to plastic pollution? If we were to use a utilitarian theory, so utilitarians, they say the way we define right action and wrong action is that the right thing to do is whatever will yield maximum preference satisfaction and minimum preference dissatisfaction. Given that most of us prefer to be happy and not suffering, and the idea is we just want to make everybody as happy as you can and cause as little pain as you can, right? Given how little satisfaction is yielded by most plastics, don't forget that 40% is single-use packaging whose value is just gone in minutes, and substantial harms to human and animal health, there's little doubt that current levels of plastic pollution cannot be morally justified on utilitarian grounds. A Kantian, a totally different approach to right and wrong, Kantian ethics argue that policy cannot be morally justified if moral agents could not in principle consent to it. So for Kantian, the most important thing is not trying to make everybody happy. The most important thing is trying to make sure that we respect individuals' capacity for free choice, right? That we don't force you into things over which you couldn't possibly consent, right? We're not manipulating you and failing to respect your basic dignity and freedom. The principle of prima facie political equality grounded in a Kantian ethic, and this is from the philosopher Kristen Schrader-Frechette. She's up at Notre Dame, but she says, if you're applying that Kantian ethic, you have to say, in principle, other things being equal, we all have basic political equality. But is the way that plastic pollution is dispersed at this point fair? Could everyone consent to it? No, right? That most of the benefit is going to people in really rich nations like ours, and the harm is disproportionately negatively impacting people who didn't get to have any consent over this and who are not really benefiting, right? They're getting a lot of the harms and not the benefit. Benefits accrue almost entirely to the current generation, while harms accrue primarily to distant, present, and future others who cannot, in principle, consent. Okay, so what if people, we've got a case that it's morally wrong what we're doing, so what could we do globally to address plastic pollution? In 2018, the Global Plastic Action Partnership, or GPAP, was formed. Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Dow, and Nestle are 4 of the founding members of GPAP. Coca-Cola pledged that they would shift to 100% recyclable packaging by 2025. Dow is financing waste management initiatives to cut plastic leakage by 45%. Amazon has promised to end single-use packaging in India. Indonesia, the world's second big, well, that's before the most recent study in 2020, but as of 2019, Indonesia was considered the world's second biggest contributor to ocean plastic pollution. They signed on to the GPAP and promised to cut 70% of the marine dumping of plastics by 2025. However, there's some concern about these measures, that they might be more greenwash than really taking responsibility for addressing that pollution. GPAP efforts thus far are fairly inadequate. Coke's commitment to recyclable packaging, for instance, that sounds great until you realize most of the places where people are, drinking up the Coke, there just isn't any plastic recycling in place. And it's not really recycling, okay? You're using it one more time before it just gets thrown away, right? So it's ultimately probably little more than greenwash. Globally, only about 10 to 15% of plastic is actually recycled in 2019. And even then, it's downcycled. It's not really infinitely recycled, used just one more time. Also note that colored plastics are often not recyclable because of the dyes that are in them, so only white and clear plastic is actually easily recycled. Dow's commitment is a commitment to slightly reduce pollution. Maybe they go, that's great, they want to have less pollution. Well, hold on, okay, think about this. Let's say you had a super filthy roommate, okay? Like pizza boxes on the floor, filthy socks on the couch. They're just like super dirty, right? And they're like, you know what, ma'am? I promise to, put 45% less dirty underwear on the floor. Does that make you happy? No, man. You want zero dirty underwear on the floor, okay? Like reducing a bad thing 45% is still 55% of the bad thing, okay? It's still not actually enough to fix the problem. All it's really doing is encouraging slightly less bad behavior. That's also morally inadequate, and it's especially problematic when they're trying to take public moral credit for doing something great, when all they've really done is say, I'm gonna start being slightly less terrible. Now, there are challenges, though, for business in developing an appropriate, morally defensible response. Government policies are often really unclear, and they change. We saw how many of those policies changed when the pandemic hit, or it can change when the president changes, or the composition of the legislature. For example, India had said that it would ban single-use plastics by 2022, but then they shelved the ban in October of 2019. Representatives of the Indian plastic industry were concerned over a lack of clarity and proposed rule changes, job loss, and that they didn't have viable alternatives for many of their products. Smaller companies may find it to be an especially big challenge. They may have really low margins, and so it may cost them a lot more to adjust to new rules. For example, boutique hotels in California, it's a bigger challenge for them than something like Marriott International, which already have plans in place to eliminate small single-use plastic toiletry bottles by the end of 2020. Really big global companies, they're already abiding by these plastic bans in other countries around the world. A small business that's just in one location, they haven't really geared up for those international standards per se, and it might be a bigger challenge for them. Commitments to recyclable packaging also really does not fix the problem when a nation lacks infrastructure or viable markets to ensure that recycling is actually going to happen. For example, collection systems are inefficient or just non-existent in developing nations in Asia and Africa. But even in the developed world, plastic recycling is relatively unsustainable. I mean, just think about the number of United States cities that just have gotten rid of recycling now that they don't have cheap locations abroad willing to take it. I know even recently in Evansville, I mean, it didn't go through, but there was a measure to say, you know what, our recycling's costing too much now. Like maybe we should just drop it. Also bear in mind, just 9%, and this was before 2020 when it got much worse, so it's probably lower now, but just 9% of all plastic ever produced has ever been recycled. So when they say, don't worry, it'll be recycled, yeah, probably it won't, okay? Probably it's gonna be with us for a really, really long time. Given that the United Nations reports that 40% of the global population simply lacks access to waste management systems, elimination or take-back programs would have to be a part of any truly sustainable solution for global businesses. And that response does need to be globally coordinated. The problem with purely local solutions is that they're gonna fail, right? So like, let's say I work really hard on preventing plastic pollution in Evansville. Does that mean I'm safe? No, I mean, water moves, air moves, right? I'm eating fish that came from someplace else and the fish swam all over, right? You can't address it by just trying to clean up one little area. That's not actually going to be sufficient. And also note that over half of the ocean, it's not even in any given nation's jurisdiction for legal enforcement, including garbage patches and oceanic gears. The response also must match the scale of moral harm accrued. So if we're thinking about a tiny reduction in plastic pollution, that's really entirely inadequate to address humanity's actual collective moral obligation. A lot of times we think we're just morally obligated to do stuff that people scream at us about. Well, no, okay, like you have to think about it, like what's causing the most harm, not just what are people getting mad at me about, like what's the squeaky cog. You need to think about what's the harm I'm doing and how bad is it, and think about that when you're trying to figure out what your moral duties are. Burdens also must be more fairly distributed. That is, those who benefit most from polluting should be the ones to pay the most to stop it and clean it up. This holds on content grounds as a matter of fairness, and on utilitarian grounds as a matter of motivating best outcomes. If you don't have a motivation to reduce pollution, you're not going to do it. You're not going to get those best consequences. If there's actually enforced punitive measures when you pollute, well, that makes polluting seem like a less good idea. This entails that businesses benefiting from cheap packaging and externalized disposal costs, they probably have greater obligations to mitigate related past harms and prevent future harm. So what would be a better approach to plastic pollution? Well, we need a global government resolution on best practices that does not set the bar too low, both in terms of expectations we have of business and in terms of what we're expecting government in terms of enforcing the regulation. This resolution will likely need to enforce punitive measures in the case of greenwash and illegal dumping. To make plastic less ubiquitous, market advantages, we gotta find a way to systematically remove them and or shift them so that there's a built-in business incentive to do the right thing. How do you make that happen? Sounds great, but how the hell is this gonna happen, right? Well, the first thing we could do is end subsidies of waste via publicly financed disposal, absent corporate accountability for waste production. Government fossil fuel subsidies must also end. Annually, 4 to 8% of the oil is used to produce raw plastic. Government oil subsidies undercut more sustainable market alternatives. So we're actually paying to do things that are less healthy for us in the long run. We should just stop that, right? We don't have to give those industries an extra kickback. New plastics should no longer be made from fossil fuels. Note that scale backs in fossil fuels in other industries due to concerns about greenhouse gas emissions. So for instance, the auto industry is going to shift to electric cars pretty quickly, probably quicker than most people think. Well, the fossil fuel industry is like, right? Like, where are we going to go now, right? Like, they don't want our coal plants. They don't, natural gas markets are starting to fall. They're like, what do we do? We need someone to buy our stuff. They are actively investing and pushing plastics, right? So we need to be aware that that push is extremely strong. We also need to end unnecessary single-use plastic production, reduce all unnecessary plastic productions. This includes plastics in your clothing. You may not realize that today, like I can tell you right now, my clothes all have plastic in them, right? And if you were to look at yours, they probably do too, right? When you wash that clothing, microparticles of plastic are released into the water. There's also plastic in your tea bags. They're everywhere, right? And they shed when they're washed or heated. How do we do that though? How do we get all the plastic out of our everyday lives? Well, we could look at take-back programs. For example, Germany's Green Dot program. We could tax single-use plastics. We could have innovations in reduction of packaging. There are also sustainable alternatives in packaging and products. I don't know how many of you ever go to Penny Lane, but if you get a straw there, it's, at least last time I went, the straw is made of sugar, not plastic. Right? We could also endorse the EU's January 2019 resolution calling for ending unnecessary plastic additives. We could reclassify plastic as a hazardous substance when that is appropriate. In terms of innovations, and you may have started to notice some of these innovations in markets already. I keep getting ads for like these things that look like dryer sheets, but it's actually like your laundry detergent, right? They're like, don't get plastic bottles, right? There's a lot of these innovations coming down the line. Dove, for instance, plans to collect and process more plastic than it sells by 2025 through changes in its packaging, for example, plastic-free packaging, refillable deodorant containers, or even better than just trying to reduce the plastic, why does my shampoo have to be in a bottle anyway, right? Like Lush has a shampoo bar. You don't need any packaging for that per se. Note that plastic may be necessarily and morally justified in some cases. If we're thinking about a medical device that needs to be durable with no viable alternative by which to produce it. So this is not an argument that nothing can be plastic, right? There might be times where the moral goods absolutely outweigh the moral harms, but right now, we're not even thinking, it seems like, about any of the moral harms. And even if the moral benefit is minuscule and the harm is huge, we're still just reflexively relying on plastics. If you're interested in references, there's a whole bunch of them. And if you really want them, I'll go back to them for you. But we should have plenty of time for discussion, questions.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much, Dr. Stoll. We do have one question from Tony regarding the GPAP. If you could perhaps elaborate a little bit on that and what does it stand for?
Let's see. I think it's the Global Plastics. Oops. I'm just trying to pull up I closed my PowerPoint and it's in there.
So again, if you have any questions, feel free to post them under the chat. Go ahead, Mary.
So GPAP is the Global Plastic Action Partnership. So that was, it's driven by businesses primarily trying to reduce their pollution.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other questions from the attendees?
What's happening with glass? There are some places that are trying to shift to more reliance on glass and even recycling glass. Like I know, I'm actually originally from Michigan, and in Ann Arbor, there's a place where you can buy your soda in the glass bottle and then bring it back and they'll refill it for you, right? There are some measures afoot for that. The reason why glass hasn't been as popular, even though it's actually, you know, it's great in terms of you can clean, if you're thinking about like public health, right? Like you can get glass really hot, make sure it's super clean, right? So in that way, it's you know, you think it's a good thing to do. The challenge with glass is that it's heavier and then it tends to break in shipping. So while it might be nice to see more shift towards glass, a lot of the alternative packaging you're seeing tends to be more reliant on aluminum or hemp products or just things that are super lightweight. Another thing that they are considering is the more it weighs, the more energy you have to use in transportation too. Not to say glass isn't good for stuff. It very well could be, and especially if we put in refilling systems, right? Glass makes a lot of sense.
Any other questions? I do have a couple of questions. So I'm assuming that this is not a new issue that has been happening in the past. So could you perhaps talk a little bit about history and what have been some patterns with that?
I mean, the pattern is the plastics industry knows that what they're producing is not super great for public health or for the environment. And the way that they've tried to respond when the public or government say, hey, you need to do better, is they say, oh, well, we're gonna recycle more, right? So, I mean, historically, the response has been, let's increase recycling. The problem with that, though, is that actually subsidizes the pollution creation, because you're asking municipalities, you're asking consumers, instead of it being they created a toxic thing, right? But in order to get the thing I really want, which is just in the packaging that's toxic that they created, I have to take it with it, right? So it's sort of like when you go to the garage sale and they make you take the whole box of junk and you're like, but I just wanted that one thing, right? But so because they shift towards saying, oh, we'll just recycle more, and we haven't really had investment in the recycling, and recycling, again, it's not really infinite recycling, it's more like just, you know, one time more use. That's historically been the pattern. Right now, I will say there's this, I mean, it's probably not the majority of industry, but there has been a significant investment in trying to think of creative alternatives to just saying, oh, we'll recycle, right? So there's been a lot more investment in making plastics out of different things, taking out some of those additives that make them more toxic. So that a lot of businesses have been trying to explore new models where you can reuse the packaging, or at the very least, reduce the packaging. And when it comes to, I mean, one thing you may have noticed too, if you just go to the stores, right? Like like at Christmas last year, like every place had metal straws they wanted to sell me, right? So another thing that you know, a lot of businesses are trying to encourage people to do is to buy things you can reuse, like a reusable water bottle, a reusable straw, a reusable bag, right? So instead of single-use plastics, we could do what we used to do, right? Like it actually takes more energy to make silverware than plastic, but you know, we keep getting, I mean, like you wouldn't dream of throwing out a stainless steel fork that a restaurant gave you, right? But we throw out the plastic one all the time, even though that takes more energy to make. So part of it is just rethinking how businesses are structured, right? So there's been an assumption that throwaway is good, that makes it cleaner, faster, better. And we need to rethink that systemic assumption and how our economic and waste disposal systems are set up.
So we have a couple of questions on the chat. I'm assuming you're able to see them. What would replace plastic that are used for high strength applications, such as polymers?
I am not an engineer, so I don't know the answer to that question. I will tell you, when I gave this talk at the Business Ethics Conference in Dublin, there were some engineering professors there, and they told me about a lot of things with a lot of fancy words that I don't remember. So I will tell you, I've met people who seem to think there's great things out there. I'm not an engineer, I'm an ethicist, so I couldn't answer that particular question. What else? Yeah, that's why you asked to see. I get that. That makes sense. I'm trying to think. I know that some of the engineering professors do have an interest in environmental engineering, so you might hit them up, right? They probably know more about that question than I do.
And then we have a question by Shri: who are polluting, or who's polluting more, development or developing or underdeveloped countries?
Okay, so it depends how you're framing the question, right? If you're thinking like point source, where is it leaving human hands and ending up in waterways, right? Or in the soil or wherever. A lot of times the answer to that is the developing countries, right? But the reason why that study that came out just last week said that we're polluting way more than we thought we were is because the pollution, like, so people will say, oh, well, you know, like Southeast Asia, they pollute so much. Well, what they do is they accept the boats full of plastic that the developed nations are like, hey, can we pay you to dump our crap here, right? So it just depends how you're defining the source, right? Is the source the country that's creating the product in the first place? Is the source the country that's purchasing the product, creating the demand, and then paying to dump it somewhere else? Is the source whoever was willing to be the last stop on that product's life cycle, well, until it goes to pollute the environment. So it really just depends how you're defining it. If you're thinking in terms of who has the most financial power to change things, that's going to be the developed nations, right? Because we have the power to shift demand. We have the power to stop just dumping our plastic waste on poor nations. And I would say for those who think, oh, it's the developing nations who are just dirty and don't care, like, that's really, really unfair, right? A lot of times it's the developed nations who are paying them, or sometimes not even paying them, just dumping it, right? It's a lot of single-use waste from richer nations that ends up polluting poorer nations. Not exclusively, right? But if we're looking at overall numbers, the bigger contributors are countries like the United States.
And Kathy would like to know if you have any good resource to recommend businesses we can patronize that are being more eco-friendly.
I don't have one off the top. I mean, I could tell you like global ones, but like that, it wouldn't be like Evansville specific. But what I would say, and what I can definitively say, is the best thing you can do for the environment is just not buy stuff. Okay, so like, rather than thinking, oh, well, I'm gonna buy a super eco sweater, even better, don't buy another sweater, right? Like you could have a party where you trade the clothes you don't like with your friends, right? You're like, I need to feel something new, something fresh. Have a party, trade, okay? Then it's new to them, and they can be like, oh, this is my friend's shirt, and I think of them every time I wear it, right? The single best thing you can do ecologically is just consume less, right? And think about ways to, to do that in life, right? Like one thing about the pandemic for people who stayed in more, once you don't have shopping as like a pastime, you realize, you know what, walks can be amazing, right? So can yoga or whatever, right? Like there are a lot of things we can do that aren't about consumption, that are sometimes more satisfying.
Then we have another question from Andrew. If only 10% of the recycling plastic is actually being recycled, are there efforts to increase recycling?
No, if anything, it's going in the opposite direction. Plastic recycling is being defunded for the most part, partly because the pandemic makes it harder to ensure safety. One of the other things I didn't talk about with all of these PPEs being produced, they're not actually being disposed of in a way that's safe for public health per se. And a lot of, recycling, it just involves more contact with people's hands with things, and that can be a threat. So, and there's just been, the pandemic has cost a lot of money to local municipalities, state governments, right? So the municipalities are the ones who would have been paying for the recycling. They're getting hit hard by the cost of COVID. So the last thing, if anything, they're thinking of canceling their recycling program because they're just trying to keep keep people from dying from COVID, right? That's their number one priority. They're already too short on money. So if anything, recycling programs are seeing divestment as opposed to investment. I will tell you though that hardcore environmental advocates, they're not generally super sad about plastic recycling going down because again, a lot of people think it's just greenwash, right? It makes you feel good about your plastic water bottle that you drink the water and then throw it in the trash, even though there's a perfectly good, you could have filled your water bottle up at home. My favorite thing, I just said don't buy stuff, but the favorite thing that I've bought in the last 3 years is I bought this like super insulated cup / water bottle. It's so great having ice water whenever, for all day, it's still ice water, right? Better to do something like that, have reusable than to rely on single-use plastics.
Then we have a question from Tony. Have you heard of LEED initiatives? It's a government program.
Yeah. I will say, so, in terms of why LEED initiatives have become, yes, I have heard of them. One of the reasons they've become less popular, part of it is there have been some critiques of LEED initiatives that they're too cookie cutter, right? So they'll have like a standardized set of guidelines, but maybe in one location, it matters more that in terms of the impacts on that particular local environment, maybe we need to tweak it for that local environment, right? Rather than just thinking about the standard cookie cutter thing that's going to be in place for all buildings. That's part of it. Another part of it is people don't like paying for the certificate. I know like at least I heard some people at USI say with the business building, like, we could be LEED certified, but why should we pay for that, right? Like, we're cheap, we don't want to do that. So that, that could be part of it too. I will say though, I agree that it would be good if the government incentivized green building, right? And there's actually a lot of plastic in our buildings too that you might not even be aware of. So, I think we need to think about our consumption and our environmental impacts every step of the way. And one of the, again, same thing with buildings, like you can just reduce impact if you design for reduction. That's the whole idea of reusable things instead of single-use plastics. If we thought ahead, if we planned for buildings that needed less energy, right? That needed, less resources, that there's an article by William McDonough who does environmental design stuff, and one of the things that he says is think about designing a building to be like a tree, right? A tree can actually help stabilize the soil around it. It can take in water and let it go cleaner out the other end, right? It is really, really efficient in its use of energy. Why don't we do some pioneering, right? Try to mimic biological systems, and they're really complex, creative, amazing ways of getting stuff we need, but at the same time, not hurting the ecosystem and even sometimes benefiting it. So just, yeah, planning ahead, having better design and government support for better design would be a really good step forward.
We have another question. What is more difficult in terms of arguing with individuals who don't care? Climate change or plastic? Both are painful. Which one is more?
I will say I get way more positive interest in the conversation about plastics. Now, I think that could be because people are thinking, ooh, so for Christmas, I can buy, you know, like my super insulated, super cute water bottle, and I can buy my not plastic. Like part of it is it shouldn't be the response, right? The response should be, okay, let me find a way to use less. But anytime people can feel good about buying more stuff, they're far more on board with that conversation. And I also think that the climate change conversation is one that, like it's become really politically loaded in ways that are deeply problematic. And also, I think part of it too is just that we really do have very little time to act on climate. So when you talk about it, like people should feel wicked guilty, wicked fast. They don't like that. You know, with plastics, we arguably have some time to adjust before it gets to some kind of crisis, arguably. But because, in some ways, just because climate change is more difficult, it's a harder conversation to have with people. On the flip side, though, you know, when you reduce your plastic pollution by just using less, you're probably reducing your greenhouse gas emissions too. So if you can get them on board on your anti-plastic train, they secretly joined your work on the climate train too.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Stoll, for such a wonderful presentation and discussion. And with that, we are concluding our session.